Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Serwer. I'm the director of the Conflict Management Program, and it's a real privilege to reach this moment of culmination of many months of work. The reports you're about to hear are the result of a process that starts in early September with selection of students who will go on the study trip. They apply to do that. The process proceeds with occasional meetings of the class, and it is a class, it is a course, occasional meetings of the class during the fall semester with readings assigned principally by the students. Proceeds to a January visit to a conflict zone, in this case Israel and Palestine, where we spent, I think, closer to 10 than to 7 days, if I remember correctly. It is cold in Jerusalem and especially in the West Bank in January, as some of you will have seen in the photographs. And then we come back and very quickly thereafter prepare first drafts of the chapters that go into a book, a report, call it what you like, which is hot off the presses and outside for everybody who's interested. So this is the end of that process, but I hope the beginning of continued thinking, not only about this conflict, but about many other conflicts. This is one that falls in what is generally referred to as the intractable category. Now I know a deal of the century has been promised, but one of the things that framed our effort, I think, one of the basic assumptions that we made on the basis of good evidence, I think, was that this was not going to be solved quickly, even though it's been unsolved for 70 years, and by some counts much longer than that, but I think fair to say 70 years. The students all chose, as a result, not to write about the classic final status issues in this conflict, things like borders and Jerusalem and security and refugees. With the exception of refugees, there is a chapter about refugees. It's an almost unavoidable subject, especially after having visited a refugee camp. But I think quite wisely the students saw their effort as one of finding ways in which to use this period during which the conflict is intractable to improve the chances of someday coming to a final status solution. And you will therefore hear about things that you don't usually hear about in the Israel-Palestine conflict. We're going to start with Camille Gardner, who's a second-year conflict management student who started her education at SAIS in Bologna. We're going to proceed then to Kristen Kaspar, who's a second-year conflict management student who was here last year as well. Then we'll go to Paris Khan, who is, we had some doubt about this, Paris. You are a Middle East concentrator with a minor in?
Dual concentrator. Dual
concentrator in conflict management. Good. And then we have George Mastoris, who's an MIPP in Strat. We'll proceed in that order. Professor Zartman will then comment a bit at the end, and we'll open for questions. Camille?
Thank you.
So much of what one may hear about in the news on the Arab-Israeli conflict, even the events that are unfolding in Gaza as we speak, is often reduced to mere violence, a perceived sense of intractability, and agitation expressed on both sides with the status quo. But what we were interested in understanding was not just the current state of play, but how it is we ended up here, and how yesterday's roots of the conflict can help us provide insight and recommendations for how to move forward tomorrow. A central theme that emerged both in our research prior to the trip and on the ground in Israel and Palestine was how much identity, narratives, recognition, and the real or imagined sense of fear or distrust play such an epitomizing role in explaining the current and historical gridlock, and the motivations and power dynamics at play. The topic of narratives in particular emerged in nearly every meeting with the 50-some odd individuals we met over the course of nearly 2 weeks in Israel and Palestine. And given the diversity of the perspectives we heard from the hard Israeli right to the left-leaning Israeli peace camps to refugee populations to representatives of Hamas, it was interesting to note the similarities and the incongruencies in the narratives depicted by actors on both sides, as well as each party's perception of the other side's account, and some of the inconsistencies that emerged. Yet what one Israeli government official commented that resonated with me, and I imagine it resonated with many of my peers, was his prescription for the need for therapy at a national scale in order to encourage more mutual empathy and recognition of the irreconcilable aspects of each narrative. Furthermore, we heard talk during the trip of the issue of spoilers and how each side's inability to constrain its spoilers has contributed to the hardening of narratives on both sides, especially as a result of the violence and insecurity these actors oftentimes promote or facilitate to keep with the status quo. We also felt the tension on both sides over the use of certain terminology pertaining to the conflict and how it's described. For instance, the use of apartheid versus colonialism versus occupation is critical. This choice in words can have implications on international law and for what each party can and cannot do. My colleague Sveta argues that these are not interchangeable terms and they should not be treated as such. We heard on the trip how semantics and word choice can have detrimental effects on prospective peace, as can the way in which conflict is framed by actors on both sides. For instance, the framing of the conflict as occupation, one that has existed or persisted for over 50 years, and what each party should do to best advance its interest within this frame. We heard argued that despite the Palestinian realities serving as proof of occupation, including the impact of the growth of settlements, movement and access restrictions, land and property confiscation, and the economic burden these measures have placed on the Palestinian people, Israelis resist this term, while Palestinians hold on to the narrative of occupation, but with little practical success. So in light of these issues previously described, one might wonder, how can we oscillate away from the current stalemate? Are negotiations still possible? We know negotiations can occur when there is a mutually hurting stalemate and a perceived way out. But how are we creating the conditions for the latter? It was also evident throughout the trip that the balance of power is heavily skewed in Israel's favor, and that Israel is not hurting enough, if you will, by the continuation of the conflict to provide enough impetus for her to want to create conditions to seriously negotiate its end. In the long term, it was also noted that Israel can choose two of the three: territorial integrity, democracy, and Jewish character. However, the country currently enjoys all three as a result of the ambiguity over the status of Palestinians, creating yet another reason not to negotiate. Lastly, the diverging and polarizing narratives, especially among youth, make a negotiated solution moving forward seem less and less tangible. These points beg the question of now what? Where do we go from here? To address the issues of settlement growth and failed negotiations and the conflicting narratives that often drive them, some of the policy recommendations that emerge through our analyses include promoting community peace education and greater implementation of people-to-people programs for youth and adults to facilitate greater cross-cultural communication in order to change the narrative of non-cooperation and non-engagement. Enacting mutual education reform to minimize historical bias and create a less polarizing narrative for Israeli and Palestinian youth. Pursuit of a regional agreement, for instance, exploring options for mutually enticing opportunities, which include security cooperation, development assistance, and aspects of recognition for Israel and the future for a Palestinian state. Convening PLO elections in 2018 as agreed upon in Cairo talks, as well as Palestinian participation in municipal elections in East Jerusalem. And lastly, designing and implementing both Israeli and Palestinian concessions as confidence-building measures, for instance, around education reform, interfaith dialogue, revision of the Palestinian government's current welfare system, and Israeli investments in East Jerusalem's infrastructure to improve Palestinian life and conditions for economic development. And so I will leave you with this. The current stalemate is not infinite, and opportunities for improved dialogue, particularly around narratives and the use of less polarizing vernacular and political terminology around the conflict, and economic cooperation do exist, and they should be explored. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille. We're going to Kristen next.
Yep. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. So I'm going to discuss the economic coverage that we did in our research. And as you all know, a strong and stable economy is the pillar to a functioning state, which unfortunately does not describe Palestine today. And yet there is abundant labor and natural resources in the West Bank and Gaza. So the question is, what is holding the Palestinian economy back from unleashing itself? To quickly name a few big bucket issues, there's the security and political tensions between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. There's a friction between two Palestinian leaderships. There's the restriction of movement within the Palestinian territories, a lack of investment, a lack of job creation, and that long list continues to go on. So in Palestine, it seems as if, to give a metaphor, we're asking someone who has both the swimming flippers and the swimming arms to stay afloat in deep waters, but with their hands and their feet tied back. And with these resources restrained from use, what could success even look like under those circumstances? Bringing the metaphor back to reality, how can we expect anything but a failed Palestinian state under these situations, economically speaking? However, despite the deplorable state of the Palestinian economy, there's room for optimism, which is what me and my colleagues came to, as long as the political will exists. And that is one of three overarching points that we illustrate in our chapter on economics. At first, there are options. The West Bank and Gaza may not get to a point of incredible growth in the near future, but if given the opportunity, they have the potential to achieve sustainable growth that would create much needed stability. Second, if the poor policies and restrictions that currently undermine the Palestinian economy are not lifted, an effort required by both Palestinian leadership and the government of Israel, there's no doubt that the security climate will continue to deteriorate. A lack of economic opportunity is the tinder for violence and political instability. Third, the intentional deprivation of economic opportunities is breaking with the recognized right for people to pursue their own development. If current humanitarian issues in Palestine continue to fester, it will be an assault on global morality. So, when thinking about where to start with the economy, we argue that interventions in the energy and water sector would be strategic. A diversified energy sector with ventures such as natural gas, solar energy, and waste treatment could create a substantial number of jobs, which would be great. And then from that revenue and the energy produced, there could be further investments in industries such as telecommunications, agriculture, transportation, healthcare, commercial industry. Let your imagination kind of run with that, and they could take root and grow. And this would require the Palestinian Authority to promote and financially support energy projects and the government of Israel to loosen their controls over resources. And once released from bureaucratic controls, the already existing energy sources can be exploited. So there's such resources as the Gaza Marine Field, which has the potential to produce an estimated $2.7 billion in revenue over the course of 25 years. In regards to solar energy, the West Bank and Gaza have the same potential as Sydney and Madrid. Development in this area could create stability in Gazan households and firms, which currently depend on unreliable central grids that provide as little as 3 to 4 hours of electricity daily. And this unreliability in energy has repercussions for water security as well. Energy is needed to pump water to houses, to desalinate, and to treat wastewater. Without access to clean water, Palestinians are at risk of food shortages and disease. And these risks can't be contained necessarily. For example, in 2016, Israel was forced to close down one of its major desalination plants, Ashkelon, I might pronounce that incorrectly, for several days as a result of sewage flows out of Gaza. Considering that that particular plant supplies 15% of Israel's domestic drinking water, such a closure, even if temporary, is consequential. In 2017, several Israeli wells in close proximity to Gaza were closed down due to uncontained sewage. So right now we're seeing these growing concerns about cholera, for example. If a cholera outbreak were to travel beyond Gaza through sewage and waterways, this could be a big security risk and a big security problem. Therefore, a wastewater facility as well as a desalination plant in Gaza are critical components to a long-run solution. The current process of importing water from Israel into the Palestinian territories will not suffice. And taking a look at the West Bank, I'd also like to point out how underdevelopment in the water and energy sectors has allowed for the strategic growth of settlements, which my colleagues will talk about in more detail, but how this, in the long run, undermines the ability for Palestinians to further develop economically as they are forced into communities that are much like enclaves and undermining their overall growth. Because they are broken up into fragmented and isolated communities, this existence spells out not only continued but increasing unemployment in a rapidly growing Palestinian population. And the public sector has really borne the burden of absorbing employment in Palestine. And this has created a large and bulky and ineffective civil service, which is really needed at this point in time to manage the institutions that we so desperately need to govern. So what is really needed is private sector development. However, insecurity, different legal frameworks between the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, the restriction of movements of goods and services, even people, has discouraged investment and restrained development in this area. The Palestinian Authority and the government of Israel both have a responsibility to revise the policies that perpetuate the obstruction to private sector development. The Palestinian Authority, for example, could better manage their public spending as well as collaborate with the financial sector to create an environment conducive to entrepreneurship. The government of Israel needs to alleviate the restrictions on movement and also the restrictions on business expansion and access to resources in Area C. In addition, the blockade on Gaza is very much preventing the free flow of employment and the development of employment as well as trade. Overall, the current environment is unconducive to growth, and it must change to accommodate a growing Palestinian population because it's currently setting the youth up for failure. And we've already seen in other parts of the world the consequences of disenfranchised youth with no access to jobs and no opportunities. Violence, crime, the historical lessons are well documented. So investing in youth, investing in human capital, that is the future, and could lead to incredible economic growth. So I share these recommendations, but I also acknowledge that there's reasons why these changes have not been made, and they're usually centered on security concerns. I do acknowledge that. But I would like to remind everyone that human security really depends on collaboration. It can't be done in isolation, and it can't be done in silos. And that's why since the beginning of humankind, we've developed villages, we've developed cities, we've developed nation states. And today in our worlds, we need to look beyond political borders, and we need to really collaborate with our neighbors. Because working with your neighbors is as much your security concern as it is theirs. You both share that same security in many ways. So any potential threat from Palestine will not go away in Israel's eyes unless it has legitimate institutions to provide its citizens with security, justice, and most importantly, jobs. So therefore, we need urgent cooperation within the economic sector. Otherwise, we must prepare for the messy complexities that come with the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Paris.
Ooh, those are two very tough acts to follow. So I want to take a point that Kristen started with and elaborate on it a little bit more first. And that's this economic opportunity that exists. And one of the largest economic opportunities actually exists in the refugee population in the Palestinian diaspora. which is very well educated, and which can increase the Palestinian tax base. It can bring in much needed. Opportunities that many Palestinians don't have and don't already exist. But that can't happen right now. Maybe in the future, it's possible that these refugees could be resettled into settlements that now exist in the West Bank. But there's a problem. The settlements themselves are just a symptom. What I and many of my colleagues, the conclusion we came to was that the occupation itself is the disease. And the occupation hasn't just destroyed Palestine, it's destroyed Israel as well. This isn't Moshe Dayan's Israel. This isn't an Israel which is actively seeking out peace, which is picking up the phone and calling up all of its neighbors and calling up the Palestinians. This is a very different Israel. Israel has become increasingly hard and right-wing. It has become increasingly messianic and has become increasingly nationalistic. This is an Israel in which we've seen laws recently passed that are attempting to force the markets to close on the Shabbat, which is trying to deport the African migrant community, and in which a top religious leader claims that African migrants are monkeys. This is a problematic Israel. This is a militarizing Israel. This is an Israel in which many people forget that every person, man and woman, is a soldier. This is a society of soldiers. In particular, women have borne the brunt of this change, of this militarization. 60% of women report in the IDF that they are sexually harassed. Women in particular also make up the vast majority of Israeli NGOs, which are under extreme attack by the current Likud government and of the Israeli Supreme Court. But the Israelis aren't the only ones suffering. In fact, much larger and more importantly, the Palestinians are suffering. The Palestinians, as Kristen was talking about with youth, in particular, are hopelessly depressed. They are unemployed, no job or economic opportunities. Their women are quite educated. Most of the populace is quite educated. And increasingly, they're seeing that violence is their only option and their only opportunity. I apologize. On that note, when you begin to look around Palestinian society, and I extensively went around and I spoke to many people, it's difficult. And for them, we're seeing crippling poverty, we're seeing mental illnesses rife, we're seeing a lack of educational and medical facilities, we're seeing a lack of aid and support. But that's not just Israel's fault. There are two other large elephants in the room. The first is and excuse my language, the Jurassic Park, which is the Palestinian Authority and the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is run by people who are completely disconnected with Palestinian society at large, whose assets and families are abroad, and who no longer have a stake in the struggle. They can't solve Palestine's problems because they don't know what Palestine's problems are. In fact, they're part of Palestine's problems. The third big problem that the Palestinians face are the Jordanians, which many people don't note, but the Jordanian Waqf in particular controls much of the homes in East Jerusalem and not the Israelis. And so they're also exacerbating the problems of Palestine. All of these actors are working together and making the situation more and more worse, and the Palestinians feel abandoned. And in their abandonment, the only thing, person, entity, whatever you want to call it, that they feel hasn't abandoned them right now is God. And so they become increasingly religious. And this has helped to explain why Hamas has become so dominant and so prevalent, and if open elections were held, would win the West Bank. The situation is dangerous. In fact, I would argue it is extremely dangerous. The Palestinians are standing on an abyss, the edge of it, and they wake up every day and ask themselves, is it worth living anymore? If they come to the conclusion that is not, and they explode, it may take the entire region down with them. And that is something we need to keep in mind, that this suffering, this alienation that this occupation has bred, that this occupation has changed, which has changed Israel as much as it has ruined Palestine, something has to be done. But what can we do? The occupation has to be rolled back. That's the clearest and most obvious answer. The checkpoints, the wall, the security fence, the barrier, the raids. But on top of that, there are other things that can be done. Political reform for the PLO and the PA, allowing a new generation to come in, open and free and fair elections to be held. For increased educational and political opportunities, allowing investment to come in, as we've heard. If society continues to boil the way it's boiling now, the situation is, like I continually stress, it's going to explode. And if it explodes, as opposed to what happened in 1987 or in the early 2000s, this time it may well take everyone down with it. And in particular, I want to stress again that there are many creative solutions that are thought of, but the people need to be put first in these solutions, and we need to keep in mind what the actual suffering is and how the people on both sides have changed and how the occupation has changed them. And with that, I would like to hand it off to my colleague, George. Thank you.
Thank you, Paris. George?
Thanks very much, Paris. Thanks, everyone. Thank you to Johns Hopkins and Professor Zartman and Serwer as well for giving us what was an incredible, enlightening, and enriching opportunity. I wanted to pick up with, I guess, where Paris left us, which is on the brink of a precipice or an abyss. Certainly, there have been a number of initiatives that have been floated as of late to try to reach some sort of solution, but I think, as Professor Serwer said earlier, the prospects are not particularly bright. Certainly, the public sentiment throughout the Middle East still remains very much pro-Palestinian, very much anti-Israeli, and very much of the mind that this problem, this intractable conflict, has to be solved as a precondition to any sort of wider peace. I'm not necessarily sure I agree with that, but certainly that is the sentiment throughout. In line with that, we have seen a move back towards a regional type solution. This is something that Aaron Huff's paper deals with in some detail and quite well. He talks about recent initiatives supported by the Trump administration among Sunni Arab states to try to work with Israel towards some kind of rapprochement and some kind of solution of the problem. Traditionally, there have been efforts, and these efforts have been, okay, here's the trade. If Israel, if you can reach some sort of accommodating peace the Palestinians are happy with, then we, the Sunni Arab states, will attempt to normalize relations, will recognize you as a state. And that's traditionally been known as sort of an inside-out approach. What has caught on more recently is an outside-in approach, where this rapprochement between the Sunni Arab states, on the one hand, and Israel on the other, comes first. And with cooperation with the United States, they're going to come up with some sort of plan that eventually they'll allow, a Palestinian state or statelet of sorts to take root. What's happened, however, is that while this cooperation between Sunni Arab states and Israel has occurred, driven mostly by their twin fears of Iran on the one hand, which is driving a lot of this increased security cooperation, and also by ISIS and other Islamist groups, which pose an existential threat to both Israel and to a lot of the neighboring Arab countries. The second part of that, that is the actual move towards some kind of peace initiative, hasn't really gotten off the ground as well. And we're all waiting, as Professor Serwer mentioned, for the Trump administration to roll out its particular outside-in plan. They've been speaking with the regional players. But there are hurdles to the adoption of any such plan. One, of course, is public sentiment in those countries. It's going to take an awful lot of political will, even for an MBS, or for the leaders of Egypt or Jordan or the Gulf states to actually get enough public support and not sort of create a backlash unless the solution they come up with is one which is at least minimally acceptable to the Palestinian side. Second, it's unclear whether the Israeli right wing is really going to go along with such a solution at this point also. We spoke with people in Tel Aviv who were very confident that they need to come up with a top-down solution, a regional plan, and then eventually they would be able to convince the public of its wisdom. But a lot of what we saw on the ground and a lot of the folks we talked to don't think it'll be quite that easy. I mentioned the Trump administration also. It has a role to play. I think some observers might say they're not off to the greatest start, but especially in terms of the recognition of Jerusalem as an Israeli capital, which didn't seem to change too much on the ground, but was viewed as a squandered opportunity, because at the end of the day, they might have used that to extract some concessions from the Israeli side, or the administration might have said, we do recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. We will move our embassy there, but we want to see a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. And that was something which was lacking. The result of that, of course, as Gilly Benitez describes, is the fact that the Palestinians have left the table entirely at this point. They've decided that the U.S. is not a fair and impartial mediator, that the U.S. should have no role mediating the conflict. And to date, they've refused to meet with representatives of the Trump administration. And it's unclear how the plan which is being formulated is going to get off the ground without Palestinian participation. It's possible this is a negotiating tactic on Abbas's part, that he feels the Trump administration will realize this is a non-starter without Palestinian participation and thus sweeten the deal in some way. And there has been some report of movement on the side of the United States in recent weeks that they might be looking at something and might, shift their so far pro-Israeli position. But so far we haven't seen anything tangible, and I guess we're all waiting with bated breath to see what comes out of this administration in terms of a policy proposal. So the Palestinians have left the table. And they have gone back to a strategy they've utilized off and on, but more on than off in recent years, which is trying to internationalize the conflict. Obviously, there has been a long-running campaign for Palestinian statehood. I think right now 136 members of the United Nations have recognized Palestine, but most of them are not Western countries. Certainly, they don't count most of the European Union members other than Sweden, and they don't count the United States. They've also supported the BDS movement. They've tried to join international organizations, and perhaps most significantly, they've taken a number of dossiers to the International Criminal Court and are seeking to have Israel convicted in absentia of war crimes relating both to their settlements, but also to the various Gaza wars that we've seen over the past decade. It's unclear how successful this strategy will be. Certainly it poses psychological and symbolic benefits for the Palestinian people, but the strategic reason behind it, that is to increase economic pressure on Israel, to increase political pressure from the international community, does not seem to have gotten very far as of yet. And if anything, it seems to have reified a siege mentality amongst the Israelis in a sense that they are persecuted, which fits into the narratives that Camille was talking about, and particularly a historical narrative which has shaped the Israeli, which has been shaped by the Israeli experience and continues to shape it. Given that lack of progress on the Palestinian side, utilizing such a strategy, is there something else they might be able to do? And one thing which might enable them to move closer towards a mutually hurting stalemate of the type that we talked about earlier, because this really is a costless occupation for many of the Israelis, especially those outside of Jerusalem, is to step up an internal campaign, whether that's agitating for a one-state solution, whether that's launching an equal rights campaign and a nonviolent campaign, whether that's at its most extreme, turning over the keys to Israel and saying, listen, you own this right now, and look at the demographics. You now have more Palestinians, or almost as many Palestinians, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. What are you going to do? Can you remain a Jewish state and remain democratic? And perhaps cause some more international pressure that way. It doesn't seem realistic that the Palestinians, given what they have gained, given the fact they do administer some cities right now, would move in so extreme a direction. But certainly lesser steps, like an equal rights campaign, a nonviolent campaign, might have some of the intended effect, might engender more international sympathy. Also, simple things like voting. Israelis in Jerusalem have the right to vote in the East Jerusalem municipal elections. They have not done so, ever. They've boycotted the elections, which they see as illegal, and they don't want to be viewed as collaborators. But at the end of the day, you have 40% of Jerusalem not voting. If those people voted and they elected members to East Jerusalem, that might bring home to the Israelis exactly what they would be staring at if, in fact, there is not a second state, and if, in fact, you end up with Israel which has Palestinians within it without an autonomous region or without an independent state. So I guess that, in terms of policy recommendations, that would be one thing. From the Palestinian side, certainly pursuing anything which would confront Israelis sooner with a choice they've been kicking down the road for a while. For the Israelis, I suppose the policy recommendation would be stop kicking the can down the road. You're facing a demographic situation which is a difficult one at best, and at some point you'll have to confront the reality of having more Palestinians in the territory that you either occupy or that you live in. And there aren't a lot of good solutions to that. One of the ones which might present itself is actually recognizing some sort of Palestinian state. On that note, I will end and turn it over to Professor Zartman.
Thank you, George. Professor?
At Hopkins, we think of ourselves as a research university, and we think of not of students and faculty, but of junior scholars and senior scholars. And I must say that the junior scholars that we traveled with during the 10 days in Israel and Palestine were an extraordinary group of people who did penetrating research, asked embarrassing questions, and then wrote some excellent pieces on possibilities, if not for a full solution, for pieces of a solution, for confidence-building mechanisms, for measures that could be taken to improve the situation. And the report that we have here, I recommend to everybody because it's extremely well done. Unfortunately, the small measures that are suggested, the measures of improvement of the situation, depend on the same will whose absence keeps us from a final type of solution, an equitable outcome to the Palestinian situation. Professor Serwer said that it's not going to be solved quickly, and that's true, but it is being solved slowly. The situation has been described to us in the very first interview that we had here by the member of the Israeli embassy as a situation where, yes, it can go on like this. And Palestinians would agree with dismay and despair that indeed it can go on like this. What we're facing is not the choice that we're told so often is before us, that is of a one-state solution or a two-state solution, but rather each of these contains two types of outcome. There can be, as has been pointed out, a one-state solution, as we tend to think about it as an alternative, that is one in which there are equal rights for the whole population, and then the Israelis have to face, the current Israelis have to face the question, will they be Jewish, will the state be Jewish, or will it be democratic? But there is another one-state solution, and that is an apartheid solution, in which the one state takes in the population, the non-Jewish population that it has, and confines it to particular areas and particular functions in an unequal type of situation. And it rules this as states rule in matters of urgency by repression, as the apartheid state did. There's also a two-state solution. We're used to thinking of that as two states down the middle, around the current, the 1949-1967 boundaries. It comprises 22% of the original Palestine mandate, and in that 22%, 10% or 12% is under a single Israeli rule. That leaves 10% that is under partial or whole Palestinian control at the present time. That's not much. So we can have a two-state solution in which the current the 67 boundaries are observed, a couple little land swaps perhaps, and in which then Palestine is able to develop the potentialities that some of the reports have developed. Or we can have one that is cut up into those pieces, the remaining 10% of the original mandate, and in which we have a set of Bantustans. That's the choice. Happily, we're on the edge of a year of choosing, in which there will be elections both on the Israeli and the Palestinian side, and a chance to bring in new leadership. And the new leadership will give us a choice out of those four options. So stick around, and the ingredients for that are in this book that I recommend to you.
Thank you very much. I had neglected to mention earlier that I think we have all the authors in the room who, in addition to the four here, there are 9 others, and I hope they will pitch in when questions arise that fall in their bailiwick. So I'll open the floor to questions, either about the process, the conclusions, as you like. Yael.
Hi. Great report. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I am really looking forward to it, and your presentations were also very interesting. Just from looking in the table of contents, I saw it was striking, and also Professor Serwer mentioned this to me before, so it was in my mind, but in terms of when you talk about the core issues of the conflict, which are the issues that are negotiated in any final status agreement, you don't cover them. There's also an opinion that is interesting to look at, and you cover narratives, but would you agree that the core issues that are preventing any progress would be over narratives? And was the decision not to cover any of the final status agreements one that you guys chose as students and as young researchers because you felt that those issues had been amply covered? And number two, how did you also, just because you had very extensive meetings with very interesting people that a lot of Israelis and other researchers don't have access to, if you said Hamas representatives, how do you guys feel about alternatives to the two-state solution? Not in a way to push the two sides towards a two-state solution, like you mentioned that potentially pushing for a one-state, which then I guess would lead to a two-state, but actually did you meet with any people? I know there are political organizations in Palestine that are supporting a one-state solution. There's also plans for a confederate solution, which is joint Israeli and Palestinian. And then, a lot of questions. Third question would be on Hamas. Do you see any differing calculations on the Hamas leadership? They did release a new platform last year. They kind of have recognized two-state solution. Do you see any pragmatism considering the difficulties of the situation? And thank you.
Who wants to begin?
Yeah, so
Camille.
thank you for that question. I guess I'll answer the piece about narratives because that's the section I wrote on. I personally was interested in exploring the issue of narratives, both before we left, but particularly when we were on the ground. I think it was one of the topics that came up in one of our first meetings even. And it was interesting for me to hear. What I often heard was individuals describing their take on the other side's narratives and how they viewed those narratives interfering with the possibility for a dialogue. And I thought that was so critical when we start talking about, more of the final status agreement and some of those points that, when we get more to the conversation of negotiation, I thought it was interesting to unpack those narratives and understand the histories behind them and how they're evolving today before that conversation can be had on more of these final status points. And I also noticed just the diversity even within a particular group on how they defined their own narrative. So for me, it was interesting to see, again, the complexity of the narratives, how each side views the other side's narratives, and how that's contributed to ways of non-engagement and the ability to turn a blind eye in a way by some parties to the realities at hand. So that was my interest in the issue of narratives. I don't know if someone wants to touch on Hamas or...
Sure. I think just to put a finer point on the first question you asked, I do think that a lot of the students, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think a lot of us felt that a lot of these final status points have been done pretty much to death at this point, and the difficulties with them have been done to death. I think the idea was to look for things which might not have been written before, and to look for potential ways to lead slowly towards a situation in which those final status issues might be easier to resolve. To your second question, which I think is a very good one, I don't think that agitating for a one-state solution as a clear and obvious ploy to try to achieve a two-state solution will be particularly useful. In a negotiation, you have to have a credible position, have to seem that you actually believe what you're saying. So I do know there are Palestinian groups agitating for a one-state solution. I think to the extent that will present them with negotiation leverage, that has to become an officially held position of the Palestinian Authority. There are also people in the Israeli left wing who are in favor of a one-state solution with equal rights for all. I don't think that is a feasible solution. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that Israel views itself as a Jewish state, will continue to view itself as a Jewish state, and I think that's something that will continue, and I think that's actually I think it's right that it continues that way. The question is what to do to get to an equitable solution for the Palestinians as well. We met with Dalia Shinlin, who works, blanking, I think 972 is the name of the organization she works with. She wrote an article in the Washington Quarterly a couple of years ago advocating for a confederation solution, which I thought was actually very intriguing and very interesting. That also could be an intermediate it could be ultimately a resolution that the parties come to if there is a credible push by the Palestinians for equal rights, for a one-state solution. But I think they're going to need to make that push, turn inwards and turn towards nonviolent public protests in a more organized and systematic way than they've been doing thus far in order to get to a point where they might be able to leverage that into some sort of either a confederation or a two-state solution.
I guess I'll do Hamas. So Hamas. We have to remember that since Hamas is a non-state actor, they were starting with maximalist demands. We don't really know if Hamas ever believed in that they could actually reconquer Israel, or was that just bluster, was that just rhetoric, or do they want to start with a maximalist demand so that when the Israelis outreached to them, or the international community came to them, they can say, okay, we'll give up this if you do X, Y, and Z. But it seems that Hamas has come to the realization that that's actually alienated them from the international community, and that's actually reduced outreach towards them. The big question for Hamas now is, especially as we see these protests in Gaza, if Hamas's new strategy of nonviolence, of mass protest fails, and if the Israelis continue to act the way they've done, will this new leadership in Hamas be able to stand, or will it be able to consolidate itself, or will the even more hardline people begin to state that, look, you mellowed yourself and we were met with even more violence, we were met with even more guns, should we take back up the armed struggle, which is problematic in its own right, but for Hamas's new leadership, it's to find a way to not only consolidate themselves, but to meet credible actors on the other side who are willing to accommodate them, and not, as Defense Minister Lieberman stated, that the entire population of Gaza is Hamas, and that we can fire it. You can't do that. You need to outreach now, and if not, then we're going to see that the moderates who are more dominant inside Gaza right now are going to begin to lose power. And then the even more hardline organizations, including the Palestinian Islamic Jihad or the situation in the Sinai, could begin to foster into the Gaza and take control of that.
Quite a few Palestinians made the point to us that a one-state solution is what the PLO originally wanted. Its great compromise was agreeing to the two-state solution. It's wise to remember that, I think. Please.
Well, somebody's being selected. Let me just add on Hamas. Remember, there are two Hamases, as in many organizations of this kind, the militant and the political. We didn't talk to the military, the Qassam Brigade and people like that. It was striking that everybody that we talked to on representing Hamas talked about nonviolent resistance. And discussed that and pointed out the usefulness and importance of nonviolent resistance. There's another part to the organization, so you can't just talk about Hamas as a single noun.
Dan Lieberman. Yeah, we talk about a one-state or two-state solution, but hasn't Israel already provided the solution, which is a no-state? Israel has no borders, has never tried to define its borders. It has no constitution. There is no Israel nationality. You can be an Israel citizen, but there is no Israel nationality. And up till now, their so-called capital was never recognized. So Israel, in effect, is really not a state. And it seems to want to be that way. And to me, that seems to be the real problem. In other words, investigating that problem, and allied to that problem, we can see the destruction of Iraq, the destruction of Libya, the parting of Sudan, and now destruction of Syria, and only one man standing, which is Iran. So it seems to me that we're getting away from the real problem. Yes, the Palestinians' situation is a problem, but that is not solvable until you solve the real problem.
I take that as a comment rather than a question, but
No, it's a question.
but
It's a-
anybody who wants to
no,
respond,
I'm sorry.
may do so.
I'm sorry, it's a question. Is the fact that Israel is never declared borders, and the other part, the real problem?
Paris, did you want to
I
respond?
can comment, or Emma, if you. That's fine.
Oh, Emma.
So this kind of highlights one of the things that I concluded in my essay, which is that Israel is sort of straddling this decision it has to make between these three characteristics that it wants, one of which being having the West Bank, being all of Judea and Samaria, the second being democratic, and then the third being a Jewish state. By not solidifying where exactly Israel ends and some other thing begins, which is where these other people are, who are not citizens but are living on our land, they're able to not make that decision. And as George was calling it, kicking the can down the road. Eventually, I think they're going to have to make that decision. They can really only pick two out of the three. One of the very curious things that happened on the trip was the level of cognitive dissonance that occurred whenever you tried to have that conversation with especially young Israelis, not as much the older ones, but the younger ones. The responses would not engage that kind of idea. Maybe Paris, you want to take on the second part of what he was saying?
Sure. The regionalism, that's you, Aaron, but for Greater Israel, that's something that I talk about in my chapter as well, and that's one of the problems, in that it's changing society by not having hard borders, by fostering messianic myths, especially after the 1967 war. It's exacerbating the situation, especially within the young, who are beginning to take even more of a hard line, more of a messianic approach. In particular, the former head of the Shin Bet warned that a state of Judea was forming within the settlements, which was vastly different than the people and the society in Tel Aviv and in Haifa, and that if Israel doesn't legislate, if Israel doesn't stop and create hard borders, or at least come to some kind of terms with the Palestinians, so, we're not going to go past this part, it's actually going to make the situation internally within Israel worse between those who are more secular and more liberal and who believe that, Israel should be a democratic society, as Emma was saying, versus those who believe that Israel is this maximalist empire of some revisionist empire to fulfill some kind of prophecy.
Okay, thank you. Now we've got lots of questions. Isabel, why don't we start here, and we'll work our way around.
Hi, I'm Samira Daniels. I've known all of you for a long time, Dan Serwer and Professor Hartman, both. Can you hear me?
Yeah, speaking.
Oh, okay.
Speak right into it.
All right. I've been following the European comment, and UN commentary on these recent, violence there. And I was wondering, in terms of this situation, where do you and the sort of divide that now is between Europe and the countries that acknowledge Palestine and so forth, and the United States? How do you think that this violence and the European posture on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, how do you what ways do you think that is shaping it, in particular in light of this violence and the UN?
Okay, let's take two at a time.
Chloe Colbert, MA grad, 1711. I wanted to ask, going back to the idea, Paris, of Greater Israel, and there was talk of refugees coming in the 90s. I'm wondering what's the impact of, Jewish expats or a greater Israel identity outside of Israel, as well as a greater Palestinian identity? What's the impact economically on Israel and Palestine, as well as politically, and how their remittances or their money coming in affects the narrative and the dialogue?
Where did I see Aaron sitting?
Aaron's.
Yeah. Did you want to address the Europe question?
I focused on the Arab states.
Yeah, you did. I was forgetting whether you dealt with Europe.
George or I can do it.
Okay,
I can speak to
George.
that briefly, I guess. So you're right. There is a significant divide in public opinion and even the position of governments between Europe and the United States in terms of how to confront this question. That said, the European countries haven't really stepped to the plate in any tangible way as of yet. And I think until they do, I don't think Israel will necessarily feel any pressure from them that they haven't seen before. The governments can say what they want, they can condemn the violence in Gaza, but until there are real economic or political repercussions for Israel, I'm not sure what incentive the Israelis have to change the policies that they have been pursuing for quite some time.
It's still a kind of a sore of
the dialogue that It is, and I think it's a sore spot with the Israelis. I mean, I think they think the whole world is against them, and that's what we were talking about. That's something which feeds into an Israeli narrative. But at the end of the day, there haven't been actual tangible repercussions, and I think the result, far from sort of pressuring Israel to modify its behavior in a way that Europeans would like to see, the result has been the opposite, which is these folks aren't really, they don't have our interests at heart. They aren't really looking at this in a fair and unbiased way. And so their opinions are less legitimate in our eyes than they used to be.
Chloe's question?
Yeah, sure. And I can add to that just in brief. It reiterates the myth of not only Israel standing alone, but the changes in society. As you saw in the Jerusalem vote, it was the United States, some islands, and I think Guatemala and the rest of the world opposed that. But that's something that the Israeli leadership keeps missing, is that outside of the United States, it's increasingly isolated. And it continues to build a Spartan myth, unfortunately. As for Greater Israel, in my chapter, I do cover demographics in particular a lot. One of the largest Greater Israel unfortunate mantras has come from former Soviet immigrants, Russian immigrants in particular. A lot of U.S. immigrants who have poured in recently and made aliyah to Israel, as they call it, have also moved into the settlements. But there's definitely an economic incentive there as well. A lot of the Russian immigrants, a lot of the Mizrahi or the Arab or immigrant Jews, and even some of the ones that are coming from the United States are usually lower socioeconomic. And the settlements provide more benefits. It's cheaper housing. It's more accommodating towards them. And so that's helping Likud sustain its votes by giving these people services that they normally couldn't afford, or housing they couldn't afford, or a lifestyle they couldn't afford. Another impact is that the United States obviously has a huge role in basically fomenting this as of now. Money sent to settlements is tax-free. It's tax-deductible, actually. And then as we know, the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, as well as the current U.S. ambassador to Israel, are pro-settlement. They do fund the settlements, and so there's definitely an economic play in there as well. But overall, there is definitely a demographic, what do I want to call it, a demographic color to the settlements. It's not really the older Israelis who have been there since before the 40s, or the more secular Israelis who are in Haifa or in Tel Aviv, but these are the more religious Israelis, the ones who are they pray more. They have stronger traditionalist views as opposed to the ones on the other side of the country, and they're the ones who are increasingly making up the settlements and are driving this desire or this myth of the Greater Israel.
Does anyone start writing checks for settlements? I think what Paris means is that contributions to organizations, charitable organizations in the U.S. that support settlements, are tax deductible. I want to go here, please.
Thank you. My name is Nizar Farsakh. I'm actually a former member of the Palestinian negotiating team. I do want to commend you guys for your nuanced analysis. I'm really impressed. And I want to also commend SAIS. You definitely have great junior researchers here. It's not often that you hear a balanced analysis in the city. I have two questions, two sides. One that's content and the other is more thematic. So the thematic one is more on, you've had these interactions and you came to your conclusions. What are things that you wished you asked or information that you wish you had gotten in order to get better recommendations? That's one. The second one, I want to challenge the limit of the imagination. And apologies for my skepticism, but back in 1947, if you asked Arabs in April 1947 that 80% of them would be kicked out, they would have thought that you're crazy, right? So the scenario where Arabs would be kicked out from Israel is not far-fetched when you have around 500,000 Syrians that were killed in the last few years and like 13 million refugees, right? So did you see such scenarios? Did you hear such scenarios, regardless of, because you said myth, Paras. Unfortunately, what you think are myths are facts for other people that animate their decisions. I know from my family members that think they can actually destroy Israel. And I know many Israelis that are perfectly comfortable, living with Palestinians as second-class citizens. Like there's the Sharon doctrine, right? Where you'll have a war every 10, 15 years, right? You make the Palestinians docile, then you'll have more settlements. Then after 10, 15 years, you'll have another war, right? So that it is possible to continually live by the sword as in Israel. So what have you been your interactions with people you spoke with that were examples of that? Thank you.
I'd love to answer the first question. Sorry. So I think something I became very conscious of that I realized might have put a barrier to our research in some ways is not all of us were Americans, the majority of us were Americans, and you have grown up hearing about this conflict, and you come in with a particular framework, a certain set of expectations to everything, to how you interact with people, to how you ask questions. And I only had the opportunity once to ask some of our panelists when we were there, just, what questions are we not asking you? Like we are restrained within our own understanding, and that limits our research to a very contained concept of what is going on based on what's sticking out to us, a lot of it influenced by our media. And so I think I would have, if I were to go and do further research, I think one part of that would be asking more questions like that, like how to get out of my own narrative, ways to break out of that and have people tell me what questions I'm not thinking of. And that would have helped, I think, develop our research further. And I think the second part is, we had a great 11 days. It was 12-hour days. We talked to a lot of people, but I think there's something to be said about observing. And I think being in the presence of that conflict and taking nuanced observations would have really developed research in a different way. I think we got great exposure and great answers, but I think there's much more to be done. So that's something I came away from more aware of. Mm-hmm.
I agree with everything Kristen said, particularly I guess the usefulness in steeping yourself in a culture, in a conflict for a while. I mean, just being there and speaking with people who had lived through this and seeing the physicality of the West Bank, seeing the settlements, seeing the Green Line, seeing the wall, I think was an incredibly valuable perspective for me, certainly, and I think for all of us. There is one question I wanted to mention that I really wish I had asked. And we spoke with the mayor of Efrat, which is a settlement outside of Jerusalem, and he spoke about he spoke about his willingness to his openness to the idea of a Palestinian state and that. And the question that I wish I had asked him was whether, if that Palestinian state had Efrat within its borders, would he want to live there? And would he consent to be governed by a Palestinian state? Even if he voted in Israel in some sort of confederation solution, but would he keep his home and actually have his municipal services conducted by a Palestinian government?
Yeah, and just to add quickly, I also wanted to kind of push that individual a little bit more to understand kind of what I experienced as like a cognitive dissonance, if you will, on the issue of settlements and how this particular settlement kept expanding westward towards Bethlehem. And I would have been a bit more curious. We didn't necessarily have the time for the questions to ask. But in addition to that, we met with a member of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and one of the anecdotes that he proposed, which really kind of stuck out with me, we only had him again for about 5 minutes, so there wasn't really much time for questions, but he talked about his daughter, and he came into the room one time and she was crying, and he asked, what happened? And her answer was, well, it all started when she hit me back. And, I was so curious to get more, what he meant with that. And if I'd had the time, I definitely would have pushed the envelope a little more to understand. And finally, the issue of the Arab-Israeli political participation, we met with a member of the Knesset who is Arab-Israeli, and I would have been more interested to know what he's doing to encourage greater participation of his constituency within Jerusalem.
All trips have limitations, and I think it's only fair to say that we did not talk with the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, and we might have been able to answer the question about removal of Arabs, which I took to be from West Bank or from Israel proper. We might have had a better answer to that question had we talked to people on the more militant right-wing side of the equation. Let's take two right here, and then we'll go back there to finish up.
I recently read the book by Nathan Thrall of the International Crisis Group with it entitled "The Only Language They Understand," and he posits the idea. He describes the current situation with the phrase "more than one state, less than two." I was wondering if anyone who is familiar with Thrall's writings, and the book is in many ways a collection of previous articles, whether that was part of your pre-trip reading, and in response to the lady in the green jacket and the scarf who said, basically, Israeli society has to come to a decision about, which road they travel. Maybe their decision is more than one state, less than two, because the unpleasantness of random stabbings and every few years fighting in Gaza, which I understand some people in the Israeli military have described as mowing the grass.
Yeah, let me take it. The question's clear. The question is clear. So you want to state it once again?
Oh, sure. Was reading Thrall a part of anyone's preparation?
Okay. Let's leave it at that. Let me take two more. One here.
So, with the recent riotings in Gaza by the youth, it seems that a lot of their desperation has been because they don't...
Into the microphone.
That their desperation has been because they don't feel there's a lot of opportunities in Gaza. And I was actually in Israel a while back, and I saw, even just in Israel, not in occupied territories, but a lot of persecution by... you could say police officers, kind of pushing people around that were Palestinian, and you would see these, big police cars that looked more like armored tanks, driving in Jerusalem, and you couldn't help but get the sense that, no wonder they feel like they're under occupation, because they are. And I wonder, though, if there's a way to sort of divide the fact that obviously each side has long-term intractable goals. They're not going to see eye to eye on things they have not seen eye to eye on for, what has it been, 60 years. But it would seem that there should be an incentive, at least on the Israeli side, to cool tensions so that there's not these episodes of violence. And one, I like the idea for like that Kristen brought up about economic development. I mean, that's an easy way.
Let's ask for a response from the group.
Yeah.
And one down here. And then I'll go to two back there, and that'll be the end of it.
Malcolm Odell, working in peace building in Nepal, Sri Lanka, Sierra Leone, and other places. And I had the privilege of going to Israel, Palestine. I must have been 30 years ago now. I can't imagine it, but it was at the time of the first Intifada. And I was innocent and a big believer in the great new state of Israel and all it stood for. And I went with great trepidation, scared to death of the Palestinians I'd be with, and very much in admiration of the Israelis. And I came back terrified of the Israelis and very fond of the Palestinians I met. And among them I met university students and professors who had such a balanced view of things compared to the settlers swaggering through Jerusalem markets, pushing people around like Birmingham, Alabama in the 1960s. In Palestine, I felt a much more genteel and reasoned group of people that were trying to find a solution. And I saw the universities as a place where maybe some positive change could begin to develop, even though they're shut down and persecuted and so forth. That takes me to my own philosophy, which basically is built around positive deviance. We can get so discouraged about these things and see so many problems, but are there points of light? Are there groups, individuals, movements that you saw that gave you some hope that we should be focusing on? Because in the positive deviance, essentially, you look for what's working and you try to bring about more of it instead of trying to deal with the problems. Just
Okay,
find
let
out
us
and go from there.
let us try to answer that.
Are there some lights?
On Nathan Thrall, I have no idea whether any of the students have read that book. It was not formally part of the preparation, so the answer to that is no. On the economic question, Sarah, you want to deal with that?
Yeah, Nathan Thrall's have that less than one state, more than two, or something like that, is the Bantustan and the reservations that I had mentioned.
Yeah. So on the economic question, I think that there's not enough importance given to it, and it's more important than we think because of the high levels of unemployment in West Bank and mostly in Gaza. And I think it's very dangerous to have such a large amount of young people with frustrated expectations. So in my research, as you will be able to see, right now, for example, the private sector in the West Bank has just access to 1% of Area C, while Area C represents 61% of the West Bank. And there was a recent report by the World Bank who said that if the Palestinian private sector had access to Area C just by removing this very immediate obstacles, the economy of Palestine would grow 33% in 8 years. So I think we're not aware of the very negative impact that this constraints in movement and on goods and people is having on the Palestinian economy, and ultimately it will have a great benefits for the welfare of the next Palestinian generation. And Gaza is another story, but I could be talking for.
And I think for points of light, I'm thinking maybe Elizabeth, you have something to say, and Mona maybe?
Mona? I'll be quick, I promise. So I did the chapter on youth,
And while I would like to say that I have a lot of optimistic things to tell you, unfortunately, a lot of what I found was actually the opposite. That a lot of the youth, especially in Israel, are more hardline than their parents are. So the idea that we could use them as an example of positive deviance, I think, is somewhat more difficult than you would imagine. We see as well on the Palestinian side that the despair, that the lack of economic opportunity, that the lack of political opportunity, the opportunities to get your voice heard, has really seeped into their consciousness, has seeped into their identity, their narratives, the way that they view the conflict in their lives. And I think it will be very difficult to overcome that, to create opportunities for the next generation to resolve the conflict.
And if I can just jump in really quickly on the youth piece before we move to women, I think another point of light I would encourage you to look at the Peace Research Institute for the Middle East. They have that education program that I was recommending. They have brought Israeli and Palestinian academia together to build textbooks that are reflective of a less polarizing narrative. They debated and discussed at length different aspects of history and how to portray that for both Israeli and Palestinian youth. And they left a section in the textbook they created blank for the students to define their own narrative. So I think efforts like that are a bit more mutually encompassing and understanding could be a ray of light for the youth.
Mona?
Yes. Okay, so I wanted to maybe make a couple of comments to general comments that could touch upon the questions. There were many, many, many points of light, many bridge building efforts. Most people truly want to see peace. What we need to focus on is the reason why it's not happening, why there's such great pushback, who controls that, why certain words are so sensitive that are associated with narratives. And another question was, what would we ask if we knew now, if we went there? Our eyes were open. We saw, just as other comments were made, we saw something that we didn't expect to see. But the people that we were meeting with also knew that we would be coming in and experiencing that. So before we could really have an open conversation, there was somewhat of a presentation that was designed for us. But there are so many people on both sides that truly want to see a peaceful resolution. And I think what we really need to focus on is what's holding that back, and why aren't more people, really from the United States, doing more to bring this situation to light.
Just one more quick ray of light. I really enjoyed the meeting that we had with the grieving parents group, joint Israeli-Palestinian grieving parents and grieving, relatives. That for me was what I held on to as we were.
It was quite extraordinary. We also went to Givat Haviva, which is an organization committed to Arab-Jewish understanding. And I think maybe I can mention also that the people who on the ground who helped us organize this trip, because you can't do a trip like this without people there to help you. Walid Salem, Muddy Crystal, Galia Golan, I think they're all more than points of light.
If I could just say, I would love a chapter at the end of the book that says, here are organizations, groups that we got fired up about that we should be supporting, and give us some guidance as to who to support. I mean, as soon as I got back, I went out and joined J Street. I mean, working, and I'm not on this side, but I just wondered, what can we do to foster more points of light and build more fires under them?
Good. Let me take two more since we have a moment. Maybe what, oh, wow. Hands keep going up. Isabel, this gentleman here, Actually, okay, and then next to him,
Okay,
because
well,
he's been trying forever.
Anyway, yeah, no, because I had the privilege of actually hosting you when you were there, together with my colleague Ziad Abu Ziyad at the Palestine-Israel Journal, Hillel Schenker. And I'm very impressed by the panel and also very much looking forward to reading the study. We will write about it as well. And I have one basic question. As you probably discovered, there's a tremendous amount of pessimism on both sides, on the Israeli and Palestinian side, about the very possibility of resolving the conflict. And so I wondered, did you come back after these 11 days with a sense of greater optimism or pessimism? And I'm saying this as future senior scholars and diplomats.
Let me take one more here.
Thank you. I'm Badr al-Bandari. So my question is actually on the ongoing efforts to design a deal that's actually a little bit surrounded with secrecy. Like, for example, when Egypt Sisi just described it as the century's deal was in his meeting with President Trump, or the current mentioning from whether from Trump or MBS or other leaders. So first, I would like to make two comparisons. So we have the previous deal, which Paris is referred to, which is Rabin's Yasser Arafat's one. Both Rabin and Yasser Arafat at this time had quiet and very, and it's hard to deny, a very good popularity among the Palestinians and the Israelis, and also in the international community. The current leaders that are actually working on this deal. So we have a current Palestinian government that's barely, you can hardly say if it's supportive or not. And however, actually, our public opinion is not very positive about it. And also you have other authoritarian leaders, whether they are conservative or rightists from the Israeli or the U.S. side, or authoritarian leaders in Egypt, Jordan, or in Saudi Arabia. So do you think was this secrecy that's surrounding that deal, as the professor mentioned before, they are working on designing it and then they will bring it up to the public? Do you think so? My first question is, what's the probabilities of getting a legit and fair deal that will be accepted by the public? The second thing, what will prevent the public from delegitimizing it from the beginning? Because these people are working on it behind the doors. And so thank you.
Okay, let's take those two, Hillel. Let me thank you for your hospitality and the discussion we had with you. So students, did we come away more optimistic or more pessimistic?
I'm all despair. My chapter is the apocalypse. So just
literally is the apocalypse.
It is. So, yeah.
But
Just Mona.
I think just to be optimistic, I think you have to look at that there's much more awareness of this situation, and more people are seeing it, more people are commenting, more people are concerned. To have a group like us go out and have the meetings that we had and the exposure, and to come back and talk to you and to write about it, that's extremely a positive step in the right direction. The fact that we have to almost ignore the world leaders that are involved in making the deal and have it come from us, it's empowering us, and it's making us take more responsibility, Because the problem is not just in Israel and Palestine with bringing a resolution to this, as we're all aware of. I mean, there is a big problem with the other regional powers that are being called to present the secret solution. So I just think that there's much more awareness, and that is a definite positive step.
Thank you.
Well, I agree with most of the things you said, except that I don't read all of that as making me more optimistic, and this may be representative of others in the group. I came away with an intense sense that the conflict is invisible to a lot of Israelis, which means that, and it is becoming more invisible as the day goes by. We drove along the wall, and they had painted on a certain section of the wall a scene as though you were looking at a bridge, and under the bridge was painted empty fields. And in reality, on the other side of the wall was a Palestinian town. And for me, that was a metaphor kind of for this erasure of the conflict from the Israeli current narrative of what the world looks like. That means that this is not something that's urgent for Israelis. For a conflict to be negotiated as solved through the negotiation, it has to be a mutually hurting conflict. And some Israelis are hurting by it, but it's not hurting the society as a whole. And then to answer the question that I believe you posed as to whether you think that a settlement is going to be reached that will be acceptable to both sides, I wrote the chapter on negotiations and prospects for that and how to get towards that. My conclusion is that this will be settled slowly, creepingly, and along the lines of power, not by a settlement that the people will accept. I don't think there's enough overlap, and I don't think there's the political will, especially on the Israeli side.
But I... I think the current power balance favors the Israelis greatly, and I think that will be reflected in the final outcome.
I'm going to have to wrap up, and I wanted any of the students who have something to say and haven't said it, including those in the audience, to indicate, and then I'll have a quick word.
I just want to make a quick comment, I guess, to your question. I also found it quite constructive, and I'm really glad we had the opportunity to sit across the table from individuals who sat in previous rounds of negotiation, and hearing how frank and honest they were about the mistakes they made and what they learned from those experiences. So I think making those lessons learned a bit more well-known and pronounced beyond rooms and meetings like that, I think could be constructive moving forward. And I just do really want to thank the professors and Isabel and all of my peers for the questions that you asked. I learned so much about the conflict in such a short amount of time. So.
And I guess I also want to reiterate the thanks to everybody, and thank you to everyone coming here today. And to finally add, so I did focus not just on economics, but on water management and that dynamic. And so I'd say another light that you can look into is EcoPeace. I think they're doing a lot of great work, but again, it's more on the people-to-people scale, and it looks like we need a lot of intervention at the political leadership scale. I think that's where the discrepancy is really creating more pain, is that there's a lot of activity maybe on the ground, but how it interjects up at the top is where we need to focus on.
So I also would like to thank everybody on the trip for coming, those of you who are going to read our book. I do want to comment that a lot of the questions seem to bleed into one chapter or another, so I would definitely recommend you all take the time to read it, because a lot of the questions you asked are actually explained more in depth in the book itself. And the last thing I want to say is, I wanted to write the paper and run away from it, but this seems to be like a lifelong thing now, and I can't run away. And somehow the panel, it just keeps coming back. And so Israel and Palestine is like, it's a part of my soul now. Like, no matter what I do, where I go, it's there, and it's going to be there forever. And I guess I'm glad and I'm blessed that I was able to experience all of this journey. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a pretty gripping experience, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to have done it. And I wanted to again thank everyone for coming and the professors in the school for allowing me that opportunity. I guess the one thing I wanted to add, most of the points of light that we saw rests on the premise that dialogue is necessary, and a lot of these are joint Israeli-Palestinian organizations where you have people from both communities speaking to one another. And that dialogue is incredibly important. And that's precisely why I think a lot of us came away so pessimistic, because right now you have a separation between the two communities because there is no peace, right? That's why the separation exists. But as long as you have that separation, it's going to be really difficult to achieve peace. So I think all of us perceive this cycle, and it's difficult to know where we might be able to break through.
Well, I too want to thank you all, and I want to thank in particular the 13 students who have contributed to this volume and who did a terrific job, both in fall semester and then again on the trip, and then again after they've come back. So thank you all.